All right, so I was just talking about the Yuan dynasty and Kublai Khan. Um, so in 1271, he claimed the mandate of heaven. Um, if you are remembering some of ancient China and the concepts of the mandate of heaven, um, it's interesting to see how he came in and was able to co-opt ideas that were established in the political system of China and then secure it for himself. And so, I mean, here's what's interesting. We see that he makes himself China's emperor and continued on as the Mongol great Khan. And Yuan from the Chinese text called the I Ching. So he creates himself a quote unquote Chinese dynasty and he embraced Chinese culture. This looks a little similar, right, to what the Ptolemies did somewhat, um, and how the Greeks took over Egypt and then kind of incorporated Greek cultures, took on being like a pharaoh in the Egyptian tradition, and yet they were outsiders. And we saw with the Rus, with the Swedish Vikings coming in to Russia, creating Kiev, and then almost immediately integrating into the Slavic culture and speaking the Slavic tongue and kind of cutting themselves off from their Scandinavian selves. And then we saw the same with you see the same with the Normans, who then the Norsemen who embraced French culture. So you see these various degrees. Each case is different, but it's interesting, right? So he moved his capital from Mongolia to what is now Beijing. He developed the country, tolerated many religions, converted to Buddhism, and he even had a Christian woman as one of his 4 wives. And so again, this is always the interesting part that I always point about the Mongols. When they came in and crashed through the world, they were just killing and pillaging and doing all these crazy, just massive slaughter. And then they showed some of the greatest toleration towards religion in the middle of that. So nothing fits perfectly into a box when it comes to understanding history, right? Reportedly, his wife had a tremendous influence on his court named Chabi. She was a Buddhist, and the Chinese Confucian scholars resented her. I was kind of referring to that. They were just appalled. The Mongols were taking on aspects of Chinese culture, but for the Chinese elites who were forcibly working now under the Mongolian emperor who had the quote unquote mandate of heaven, just things like this was just appalling to them. Okay. Moving on to another aspect. So we're talking about Mongols in China. Well, the Mongols really hit the Muslim world hard. Okay. And they leave to this day a very large scar on the memory of Islamic history. So again, even though the Mongols were a similar people to the Turks, they having that set aside, the Mongols defeat the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum in 1243. Hulagu forces first attack and slaughters Shiite assassins. He has a siege on Baghdad, and then annihilates everyone, ending the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258. So remember the Abbasids, right? This is the end of them, the Mongols. And by the way, the United States was and has still been compared to the Mongols by Iraqis that were not favorable towards the U.S. invasion. So the U.S. invasion in Iraq sometimes is referred to. Sometimes the Crusader term was mentioned, but also this was the worst memory for Iraqis was this time period on what the Mongols did. and now some parallel with the United States. I'm just merely pointing out the kind of dialogue that history is used and conjured up in. Okay. His army moved into Syria and Palestine and was defeated by Egyptian Muslim Mamluks in Palestine in 1260. Okay, and so there was a time Islam could have actually been destroyed. That's how extensive this was going, and they could have been an obscure religion, something that was kind of maybe a minority. Okay, they did a lot of damage. Initially, the Mongols favored non-Western Christians over Muslims. Okay, and so remember, the Mongols have this really weird kind of pragmatic. Their approach to religion is interesting, right? To say the least. When Baghdad was sacked, the Nestorian Patriarch was rewarded. So remember I told you how the Nestorians were favored in the Abbasid court. Now, here's always what causes problems. If you are on the side of an invader, the invader better win, right? And at first, I think a lot of Christians saw some positive aspect in this. Hulagu's wife, Doku's Khatun, was Nestorian Christian herself. One Armenian Christian wrote that Hulagu and his wife were the new Constantine and Helena. There was this kind of Christian excitement. We can't let these writings assume that all the Christians felt this way. Many Christians are in support of Assad in Assyria right now because of what the opposition is and because he's been more favorable to Christians. But prior to the Civil War, many Christians also suffered under the dictatorship of Assad. But, again, different we have to always assume that different, that just because we have one source say one thing doesn't mean that all people felt that way. But in any case, the Mongols that took Syria was led by an historian named Kitbuga. So there was a Mongolian war leader who was a Nestorian Christian, which is what most of the Assyrian Christians are now. But when the Mamluks fought back, the Mongols, Christians and others were persecuted for collaborating. So basically, Christians paid a heavy toll because they ended up, the Muslims ended up gaining background, and this did not go well for them. In the middle of all this history, the added irony is that Hulagu's descendants embraced Islam by the 14th century. Okay, so the Mongols, who nearly destroyed the entire Islamic world, many of them are going to convert to Islam later on. By the way, here's some Nestorian Mongolian text, I believe. Okay, anyways. So here's just to kind of give you an idea, looking at some of them. The rulers coming out of Genghis Khan. We have the Golden Horde in Russia, which we've talked about. Jagadai in Central Asia. You have, the Khanate of the Ilkhans in Southwest Asia, and then you have the Yuan dynasty in China. I mean, so it's very extensive. I mean, just look at this map here again. So I showed a map before, but that's a lot of influence, and a lot of trade routes on top of it. In the middle of all this, the Mongolian invasions also helped spread bubonic plague, and some of you have my 104 class along with this class. For Europe, this would have devastating consequences. Devastating. So not only do we have all these wars, we also have a massive biological warfare, if you will, accidentally, but still, that really left a mark on the world. So I'm gonna leave. The clip of the crash course, and I'm going to leave a few more documentary clips for you to watch. And that's all we'll go over for this section. I think that you guys are at least, getting a flavor for some of what's being discussed. I'd like to go into it more. I thought I'd end with this poem by Khalil Gibran. He's a Lebanese Christian mystic poet. He wrote The Prophet. I will briefly read this because I think that you will appreciate the sentiment and think about what you've learned in your own history with this as you hear this poem, and maybe read it with me. He says, I was here from the moment of the beginning, and here I am still, and I shall remain here until the end of the world, for there is no ending to my grief-stricken being. I roamed the infinite sky and soared in the ideal world and floated through the firmament, but here I am, prisoner of measurement. I heard the teaching of Confucius. I listened to Brahma's wisdom. I sat by Buddha under the tree of knowledge, yet here I am existing with ignorance and heresy. I was on Sinai when Jehovah approached Moses. I saw the Nazarenes' miracles at the Jordan. I was in Medina when Muhammad visited, yet here I am, prisoner of bewilderment. Then I witnessed the might of Babylon. I learned of the glory of Egypt. I viewed the warring greatness of Rome. Yet my earlier teachings show the weakness and sorrow of these achievements. I conversed with the magicians of Ain-Dur. I debated with the priests of Assyria. I gleaned depth from the prophets of Palestine. Yet I am still seeking truth. I gathered wisdom from quiet India. I probed the antiquity of Arabia. I heard all that can be heard, yet my heart is deaf and blind. I suffered the hands of despotic rulers. I suffered slavery under insane invaders. I suffered hunger imposed by tyranny, yet I still possess some inner power with which I struggle to greet each day. My mind is filled, but my heart is empty. My body is old, but my heart is an infant. Perhaps in youth my heart will grow, but I pray to grow old and reach the moment of my return to God. Only then will my heart fill. I was here from the moment of the beginning, and here I am still, and I shall remain here until the end of the world, for there is no ending to my grief-stricken being. And I think the poem summarizes very much some sort of somber, but yet important sentiments as we think about all these conquests that all different nations have occurred with each nation, and wars and battles, and yet these legacies left behind. And so that's why I wanted to read that poem. And so again, I end with several documentary clips, and if you have any questions, please feel free to text me or email me.